Welcome to the Plant Cunning Podcast,
where we explore our relationship to plants, other people, and the mysteries of nature.
Coming to you from the high Allegheny Plateau in central New York.
We are your hosts, A.C. Stauble
and Isaac Hill. Welcome to another episode of the Plant Cunning Podcast. Today we have on Heathen esotericist, runic scholar, poet, and author Eirik Westcoat. If you're into Heathen esotericism and any of this kind of stuff, I think you'll really appreciate this episode. And if you're interested in that sort of stuff, you might also appreciate the book that I put out this year called The Heathen Golden Dawn. I put this out through Aeon Publishing, and what we did in there is synthesize heathen symbolism, runes, the Aesir and the Vanir, calling upon those divine powers, 9 herbs charm, and more of that sort of things, with the structure and the rituals of the Golden Dawn system. So I think if you are into heathen esotericism or esotericism in general, you might really enjoy this book. So you can get that from aeon.co. It's also available everywhere else that books are sold. Also, AC and I are getting ready for the Plant Cunning Conference in a couple weeks. We are having it at our small farm in central New York on July 26th through 28th. And we have some amazing speakers, including herbalist and earth elder Pam Montgomery, herbalist Seven Song out of Ithaca, ethnobotanist and folk witch Rebecca Beyer from Asheville. We have Lisa Fazio from Utica, just right up the road, who's going to be doing a class on Italian folk magic. We have Michael Bryan, one of the greatest astrologers of this generation, who is going to be teaching about medical astrology and the female anatomy. We have Mike Tamburo, who is a gong master, who's going to be filling up our 19th century all-wooden barn with the vibrations of his gongs. It's a very healing and powerful performance, sound healing situation, which I think you're going to very much enjoy. And we've got so many other amazing speakers and presenters. And my band is actually going to perform, The Hills and the Rivers. We haven't played together for a couple years, so this is going to be a reunion show. So you can get your tickets and see the full lineup at plantcunningconference.com. I hope to see you there, and I hope you enjoy the show. Okay, so today on the Plant Cunning Podcast, we have a special treat. We have Eirik Westcoat, who is a runic scholar. He has a PhD in Icelandic studies. He is a heathen and a heathen esotericist, and he's developed this system called the American Futharch, which we're going to get into. He's also written some books of poetry, of heathen poetry, which I think you'll find very interesting if you're into that sort of thing. But we're really excited to delve into this topic. And Eirik, how are you today?
Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, doing pretty well today.
Good.
It's a nice, average summer day here.
Good. Yeah.
And where are you based out of?
Near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Awesome. Isaac's stomping grounds.
Yeah, that's where we met.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Back in the day. So usually we like to start off the show with something like what brought you to the plant path, but since you're more of an esotericist and a heathen esotericist, what brought you to the path of the Northern Mysteries?
It's a long story, but to make it reasonably short, I guess this started, this would be over about 25 years ago when I guess first discovered the existence of paganism at the end of my bachelor's degree. And until that point, I had heard stories about say witchcraft or whatnot, and thought that this had nothing that correlated to today's reality. And that was a bit of a surprise to find out that things like paganism and Wicca actually existed. And of course, I had a big flurry of interest in gathering up various books, looking into various things. Things like tarot, I would eventually lose interest, but very peculiarly, in one of these early books, I would run across runes, and somehow these managed to keep my interest the entire time. And indeed, in a very good fortuitous timing, this was a final semester where I was taking a ceramics class, and even took the opportunity to make a set of rune lots in the ceramics class. And I would be on a general Wiccan or neo-pagan path for quite a while, and eventually I would shift over to more completely alliterative, and I would eventually get rid of all my tarot decks, but much more onto the runes. And as time has gone on, more alliterative and more interested into runes, and found my place in those fields.
Nice. Yeah. So you went whole hog into the heathenry.
Yes.
I mean, so you even went so far as to get a PhD in Icelandic studies, correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was the interest in heathenry was what motivated me towards graduate studies in like things like Old Norse and Viking times and Icelandic literature. And I guess that saw the development of my interests, and where they narrowed it down to specifically to poetry. So like my master's thesis was on the ideals about the poet in the works of Snorri Sturluson. And then, of course, my PhD dissertation went to look at another poetic figure, the Kraftaskalds, who did magic through improvised poetry and folk tales.
Yes. So what really sparked your interest in poetry? Like what was the inspiration for that study and for that love?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting one as to what caused the narrowing down to poetry. Like, why did my interest in Viking stuff and Norse narrow down into poetry as opposed to something else in the field? That's really hard to say. It's just somehow I picked up a fascination with, I guess, the poetic Mead myth, and it is particularly the name of it, Othrarir.
Hmm.
And this was a growing fascination. It, I think, started at the earliest levels. I do have an essay somewhere. It's on my Patreon, but not available, not to the broader public yet. In which I think maybe around 2006-ish, I slowly started to gain a fascination with the Othrarir tale and the meat of poetry.
Yeah. And I think all over the world this is the case, but especially in heathenry, magic and poetry are intricately tied together. I mean, Odin is the master of inspiration, magic as well as poetry, you know. So I think maybe do you think Odin was speaking to you?
Yes, I would say they think there's been some subtle guidance from the old man in a lot of this.
Cool.
I can
Nice.
only wonder his level of patience with me, because it seems like, on one hand, it seems like it's taken quite a while. It's been a long road, but it's still the best is yet to come.
Yeah. I definitely think that the poetry is one of the very interesting parts about that era of Scandinavian, Icelandic, even early English history. You had these warriors who would be writing poetry, and it's kind of, to me, I think of a lot of like gangster rappers, like writing poetry about like shooting up people, or and in a very similar way, these Vikings were writing poetry about battles and raiding and so on. So I think it's a interesting just image too. Yeah. So when you got into runes, and I guess that's also part of like the language itself is what it seems to be what is driving you too, like runes, poetry, and then now the American Futharch. So, and that is very tied to Odin as well. But so what languages do you speak Icelandic? I guess you would have to get.
Well, I can read Icelandic well enough. I can't claim to speak or even follow it with listening. It is, yeah, speaking practice. Icelanders are famous. You'll look online about memes about you try to speak Icelandic with them and they'll switch to English, even if you're speaking Icelandic to them, because they'll hear your accent or something. So it's
I see.
difficult, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a struggle. I guess it was. I think maybe if I hadn't finished my PhD in 4 years, maybe I could have done better at learning to speak Icelandic.
That's pretty quick.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wanted to make sure I finished the PhD before the scholarship funding ran out.
That's
Good
very,
moves.
very important.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess runes are a very big topic, and you can go very in depth into them. But say that we have some listeners who know a lot about them, and a lot of listeners who maybe don't know so much about runes. Like, maybe they've seen the characters before, but maybe they don't know the difference between like the elder Futhark and the younger Futhark, and like what what runes really are. So could you give us like a brief history of runes? Like what are runes to you? Are they just letters, or are they something more?
Okay, well, to answer some of those questions separately, to start with the brief history of the runes here, and I guess at least what we find in the archaeological records. Of course, the elder Futhark is the oldest of the systems, and as near as anyone can tell, that seems to have started roundabouts the beginning of the Common Era, maybe a little bit before that, which is uncertain. But and used to write, I guess at the time, what the linguists call the language there was something called Proto-Germanic, which is the ancestor of all the modern Germanic languages like English, German, Icelandic, Norwegian, Scandinavian languages, and then a few things that are extinct now, like Gothic. And I guess these runes were created. They don't know exactly where. I mean, they don't know. The best guess is that they got the idea for writing from perhaps Rome, or maybe an Italic or Etruscan alphabet. Or I think the Roman hypothesis is the one that has the most support. But yeah, somehow they got the idea of writing from the Romans, and then made a script adapted to their own language, and it was generally a perfect fit to their language, and that you had one rune for each of the sounds in the language. And the level of independence it shows from the Roman writing is quite remarkable, because you don't see them adopting any bizarre, like Romanesque writing conventions in order to render their language. Like we have so many in modern English. We can get to lists like, for instance, like the letter we call W. This didn't exist in the original Roman alphabet. This wasn't a creation, because like in the Middle Ages, they would write that sound, which wasn't in Roman, and they would write it with a pair of U's. And eventually this got merged into one graph. And then you have a lot of double letters in modern English, like SH, TH, and then archaic things like GH and all these things. It's like, you could say the way we write with alphabet is like, if it doesn't match the sound, just find something close and stick an H after it.
Mm-hmm.
But the elder Futhark didn't do any of that. It made a fairly exact one-to-one fit with its language. We see a lot of interesting finds and a couple of rune stones in this. It's used for a couple hundred years. But as these Germanic tribes develop and spread and their language changes, eventually, I guess the groups of tribes that become known as like the Angles and the Frisians, as the language changes there, they start to add some runes to represent new sounds that hadn't existed in their language. And some of them move over to about, I guess, Frisia, which is like roundabouts modern Belgium or Netherlands, I think. And then, of course, some of them move to Britain and become the Anglo-Saxons. And they expand their Futhark further, and we get what's usually referred to as the Anglo-Saxon Futhark. So in which the runes have been added to represent Old English. And that's the normal course. New sounds acquire in the language, and then the writing system will add new symbols for them.
Right. Whereas like in English written in Roman script currently, there are a lot of funny things going on.
Yes. And then the other direction for that's the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, and it's so named because these systems are all named after the first 6 sounds in them. In this case, it's called Anglo-Saxon Futhark because one of those sounds was starting to change.
Right. So it's Fehu, Uru, Ur. So Feo, Ur, and so on are the names of the letters. Whereas like in the alphabet, it's A, B, C, D. In the Futharks and the Futharks, it's F, U, R, T, H. Yes. Yeah. So on.
Okay, and then so those are the two, the Elder Futhark, which had 24 runes, and then the Anglo-Saxon Futhark, which upped it at various times to eventually ultimately 29 or maybe even 33, depending on some variants. And on the other end, in Scandinavia, they went through a form, and even though they had got more sounds in their language, they ended up reducing the number of staves to 16.
Mm-hmm.
And that one's called the Younger Futhark. But actually, if you want to be excessively precise about it, that would be something like Futharch using a nasalized vowel there, second vowel, because that's it. It had the nasalization was important. That's a little bit of a struggle for Americans to think of nasal vowels, but just think if you've heard of French speakers, French has nasal vowels, and lots of them, and whereas so I won't try to produce a nasal vowel too much here. It's rather unnatural if all you know is English.
Why did the Scandinavian Futhark drop to 16 letters? Why did they go less?
Yeah, that's one of the unsolved mysteries of runology. I won't try to debate go into all the theories as to why. Okay, idea I mentioned, I think, with what I was talking about my friend Scott. One idea, and I don't know if this is the true. I think maybe I don't know what the support necessarily would be, but the idea is, I guess, if you had all these, if there was like if you had like an intertribal network maintaining the system, and that they were all meeting together about this, like they would have different dialects. And maybe one way is that they found their dialects irreconcilable to some degree with the various sounds of the vowels. And so they didn't, rather than trying to complicate things, they just tried to go very simple contrasts. So there's 4 vowels in the Younger Futhark, even though the real languages have many more distinct vowels. Like these are just rough contrasts. Like you have a front vowel, and then you have an upper back vowel, a lower back vowel, and a nasal vowel. So like very rough, broad-based contrasts. And I mean, you'd have to ask someone who's studying the Younger Futhark more closely in that particular problem to what degree that might make sense. But that's a potential idea, is that they wanted something that would work a bit more cross-culturally and not being able to reconcile dialects. They just went for just complete roughness.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like common denominator.
Right.
Makes it, yeah.
Interesting.
That could definitely make sense. And do you have any ideas about why the Futharks and Futhorks are ordered F-U-T-H instead of A-B-C-D?
I do have an article in which I address this a little. It's in the pipe for publication. I won't make any projections about when it will appear. Academic publishing, if you've not dealt with it, can run a bit glacially. But okay, in which I think, in my take on the order, is that this is to be a mnemonic of some kind. Okay, and actually, well, the order is also for the purpose of excessive mnemonics. So I'll go and share a little bit about the idea, because I presented a poster on it. But my own interpretation on the possible origin of the Futhark order is that it may have been pre-literate. It may have preceded writing as a creation of the alliterative poets. Okay, and to explain what that means, roundabouts maybe 500 before the Common Era or a little later. Times are hard to pin down on this. The people who are speaking the language that becomes Proto-Germanic. Of course, like all cultures have poetry. So one time they may have had a poetry a little bit like what we see in like certain Greek or Vedic poetry. But at some point, language change comes along, messes this up. Their poetry doesn't work, and they end up reforming it. And for whatever reason, they hit upon creating what we call an alliterative poetry, where it's structurally built around matching the initial sounds of various words. So we know they get from that point A from point A to point B. We don't know exactly how that worked, because that's kind of lost to prehistory. But we do know they do end up with an alliterative poetry, and like the alliterative poetry just dominates completely. And it's the only kind they have. And my approach on this is that these alliterative poetry, now with matching these initial sounds of words being so important, I guess it ultimately occurred to me, how would they talk about this? Like, how would you talk about the sounds of these unless you gave the sounds names? So that's my approach to this, that Futhark order and names would have been created from the alliterative poets as a way to codify the system and discuss and talk about. You could say, on this line, I alliterated on Fehu, and then there's a final stress on Dagas. And you can actually discuss and name the sounds, and without the names, it becomes a little tricky to actually talk about these things. Like it would be a little awkward to say, if you want to say I alliterated on, and g. Yeah, that will get pretty tiresome if you try to do it that way really quickly.
Right. So the concept for the sounds existed before the symbols for the sounds.
Yes, that's my take. And necessitated by the poetry. And my view is that the poetry would have, and as a result, they develop this lore about they give names to the sounds and they codify their poetic system. And of course, as they don't have any writing or any way, they need to transmit all this information orally. And the best way to do that is in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So my view is under the Futharch order. So this is my suggested solution to how to get around. Like, why didn't they use ABC order if they were copying on the Romans? Or for getting writing from the Romans. So my take is they didn't use ABC order because they didn't have anything. And and having no order, they would necessarily have had to come up with their own for codifying that poetic lore. And as a result, there would be a lot of strong mnemonics in it. Various sources will discuss about how the runes they do seem to have very intriguing pairwise correspondences. Like you go, for instance, like
right.
Fehu and Uruz. This is like domestic and wild cattle. Thurasas and Ansus, two kinds of supernatural beings. And you go down the line, there's various correspondences too, some stronger than others. And then there's some places where we wonder if maybe a passage of time has like eroded some of the details, but there's enough there to think that there was a coherent system across the whole thing originally.
Yeah.
And then maybe there may be even larger structures to some degree with quartets, and then it gets a bit more speculative. I find myself wondering if there was some kind of a narrative about the rune order on some level, if there may be a short story about the order at a certain point. I mean, these kind of things would be not very durable in the long run, but in the short term, they would have been helpful for teaching it.
Right. And there is a certain, like, if you initiate yourself into the runes, there's a certain journey that you go on. But this is something that is brought up a lot lately. There are scholars. I mean, I think this is the general tendency in a lot of the academic situations to view runes as just letters and not symbols. And there's also pushback against that. But where do you stand that as both a scholar and a practitioner of esotericism? Are runes symbols or letters or both, or what are they?
Trying to get me in trouble. I'll answer that question. I think it's a little more complicated. I feel that's a bit of an older. So I think when it's dismissed that the runes were not intended as magical, I think that probably needs to be. I think that could stand to be updated, possibly for modern approaches to magic. I mean, some ways that one way I heard it defined, like sometimes I'm not sure this is everyone's. I don't really, for the most part, I haven't interested myself in that particular debate because I don't find it very interesting. But at least one formulation I heard like had what I would consider a faulty contrast. Like the idea, like in other words, the claim was like the idea of like the runes being primarily magical but only incidentally communicative. As that was one thing I ran across recently, and that's actually the way I just phrased that, primarily magical and incidentally communicative. That's actually, to my view, that's an absurdity.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yes, because at least there's a lot of approaches to understanding magic these days. I follow the semiotic approach, which considers magic as essentially communication. And so if you recognize that magic is essentially communication, the idea of something being primarily magical and yet incidentally communicative is just complete contradictory nonsense.
Right. So it would have to be inherently communicative for it to be magical.
Mm-hmm. And deliberately communicative in order to be magical. So I mean, maybe there's other more concrete ways of that particular paradox has been, or controversy has been stated, but I'd have to look into that. But yes, my hunch is maybe, I mean, if we're going to try, maybe like if we're going to say if we're going to make that challenge again, where the runes primarily magical, I think there needs to be a much better way of defining how the runes would be magical if we're going. In other words, if we're going to, I think rather than knock down a straw man, it should be set up a stronger target if they're going to knock down the idea of the runes being inherently magical.
Right. Well, I
Probably.
mean, I think that a lot of scholars now just view the runes as inherently non-magical, and like they weren't magical.
Mhm.
Like Jackson
Well, I mean,
Crawford, for instance, has put that forward, and you see a lot of people on Facebook and other places saying that like runes are letters, not symbols.
okay, well then I guess they go to the idea that they're again. I guess the idea that they were. I guess they'll say that they were used for. I mean, but they weren't inherently magical, but they were used for writing magic. I think. As again, yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, as I said, that debate's a really weird one. But I mean, we do have we have a lot of things to analyze this because we do have the Havamal verses about Odin's winning of the runes, and they're very strongly portrayed as magical there.
Right.
The idea that they're this is Havamal 138 to 145. They're certainly considered, and that's strongly magical in many senses, and I think it's undoubtedly. Well, I mean, the modern world ends up profaning everything, so it's not surprising that modern scholars would eventually come to view the runes as profane.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe that might be an interesting topic. I don't know if I would want to take my own attempt to tackle that problem on.
Yeah. I guess the other thing is
runes
that the
being
word
inherently
rune,
magical.
like the word rune itself, can mean the actual letters, but they also can mean like a mystery or like a spell or something secretive. Like so, when people like, for instance, in the Havamal, he could be referring to like those 18 spells instead of literal letters. But yeah, I mean, it seems as though whether or not they were used historically magically, which it seems as though they are used magically now.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and that's the thing. But that's an interesting thing. Like, I guess the question is like, not only were they used magically, but are they thought of as inherently magical?
yeah.
That's the review of this. But okay, that's a good point to make. We'll come back to that point when we get a little bit later talking about the American Futharch here.
What about rune stones for divination? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Or you mean like rune lots? You mean historically or modern or
Both, maybe? Yeah, I'm curious
okay,
about historically and maybe modern use too, for people who don't know.
well, interesting enough, yeah, it gets trotted out all the time. There's a reference in the Roman author Tacitus about a ritual which is, yeah, I think maybe we'd been writing about 50 in the Common Era, around about that, give or take. Let's see, but then he talks about a ritual, and it's thought like, okay, he uses a Latin word noti, and it's a question what to describe these signs that these Germanic peoples inscribe on these lot woods. And so that's the big academic debate, where these noti runes. There's not really hard evidence either way. It seems they certainly could have been runes. I think the runic finds are early enough that we can certainly suspect that there was a possibility that actual runes could be inscribed on these. But the Tacitus account does not internally really tell us one way or another. And if it's not runes, I haven't heard anyone even come close to suggesting, like, well, if they're not runes, what were they? Were they Latin letters? Were they little pictures? We don't know. And at least certainly if we're going to use, but that's why if we're going to adopt that particular, if we're going to model that particular ritual for use in divination today, which is certainly an excellent approach, the only thing we have to use for it is the runes.
Mm-hmm.
If someone comes up with an alternate idea, I'll be very interested to hear it. But say, yeah, for doing that ritual today, the only thing anyone's come up with is to use runes.
Right.
And I guess, yeah, there's interest like lot sets, like rune lot sets, such as we have today. They have never been found historically. Although in various places there are some tantalizing phrasings in some of the texts that make you wonder: are they referring to rune casting? Like for instance, the Havamal verses. There's the 8 questions at the end. Let's see. They go. I see, if like, translated roughly, it's like, do you know how to write? Do you know how to read? Do you know how to paint? Do you know how to test or try? And then do you know how to ask? Do you know how to offer? Do you know how to send? Do you know how to sacrifice or put to sleep? And a lot of these, without going into the great detail about the exact words, they certainly sound like a ritual technology of some kind that at the very minimum applies to like heathen religious worship techniques, or potentially also maybe even like runic divination of some kind. But there was no clear answer on what exactly they're referring to, except that it clearly seems to be some kind of an important ritual technology.
Yeah, and how do you use the runes as for divination these days? In a modern context, what do you think are like the best practices, or what do you yeah how do you do it?
Okay. Yes, I guess I'm working with my American Futharch. I've been kind of like ramping up very slowly at the moment, doing 3 rune casts. And one way to, I guess, kind of the basic runic cast is to draw 3 lots for a particular question, and have the 3 lots represent the 3 steads of Urther, Verdandi, and Skuld, the Norns that govern things like time and orlog. And where, I guess, Urther is more or less the past, and then Verdandi is the becoming of the present moment, and then Skuld would be something like should be, or debt or obligation, or what is due. Skuld's a little complicated. And all the good books will warn you that you should not completely map these straight up to past, present, and future and leave it at that. But these are past to Urther, I think will work. That may be reasonably accurate enough, but one should be careful of mapping Verdandi too exactly to present, and one certainly should not map Skuld too exactly onto future. Because I guess Skuld in this case it's more thought of as like a conditioned outcome. At least the Germanic approach,
like a probability.
Really, yes, something like more like a probability. I take the view of this, I guess you can get to like, what is your philosophy or theology of time or something. In other words, I take what I consider to be more of a heathen view of that the future is not this fixed entity that's predetermined.
Right. Okay.
It is in many cases very strong. It's very strongly conditioned many times. In fact, and sometimes it can be so strongly conditioned that it appears as if it's predetermined, but it ultimately is not predetermined.
Sure, but there are a lot of preconditions. I mean, like everyone will die at some point.
Yeah.
And go through stages of growth and decay during that. Yeah. So what is the American Futharch? Why is it?
So I'll start with okay, we'll start with answering that, I guess, what led me to creating that.
Okay.
I think, yeah, two different strands here on this. First, in my own approaches with like carving runes for, say, like, carving rune staves as like runic spells, I tended early on towards, I liked to do language formulas, like short words, and I especially liked doing these in the older language, because then you could have a very like direct correspondence between the way it was spoken and the runes you wrote for it. Mm-hmm. So if you're putting a word, if you're making a short, like, say, maybe if you're like writing a word in Proto-Germanic that's maybe about like 4 to 8 runes or something, it's, you take the word, it's very direct which runes you write for that. There's no guesswork. So there's a very exact correspondence to spelling and sound, and then like similar for Old English, and I tended to make some compositions in Old English that way. And I particularly liked that way of writing, because that is effectively comes down to how it originally worked. These ancient rune masters didn't have dictionaries. They had to go completely by the sounds of the words they were going to write, and then the sounds of their runes. And so, like, I enjoyed that, but like I never did much in modern English inscriptions because I knew how badly things corresponded. In modern English, if you try to use Elder Futhark for modern English, you run into a lot of difficulties there. And what I would consider is you end up treating a lot of the sounds of the language as second-class sounds. Like something like at the beginning of the word fee or fehu, I mean, you clearly have a rune there if you can use that rune for it. But then if you try to write the word ship using Elder Futharch, then you just have to resort to things that ultimately treat that as a second-class sound, whatever combination of like two runes you try to do it with, or maybe someone should have made maybe someone could have made a dotted Sewillow rune, but I didn't think that was an appropriate approach.
So it would come out to be like sip instead of ship.
Yes. And that's part of another thing to point out with the way we spell things in modern English, that conditions us to think certain ways about how the sounds actually work. And some of these are passably accurate. Many otherwise are completely off the mark. But
yeah,
that was the thread of. So I always had this desire for, I guess, or at least the propensity to want to write more inscriptions in modern English if I could write them just as well as just as exactly as the ones in Old English or Proto-Germanic. And then to come at it from the other angle, and it turns out there was never any point at which I actually set out to create a new rune system until it was literally sitting in front of me and staring me in the face. One of my big quests has been poetry. Like starting with like the alliterative poetry and actually working through writing poetry and developing that, and ultimately my own alliterative poetry revival. And it got to be about the point in early 2003, the aforementioned academic article, it's in the pipe. I finally got around, well, if taking the approach that if the Futharch names got their start from, like, in other words, the poets naming the sounds of the language for the purposes of like teaching and promoting alliterative poetry, well, then obviously this is something I should do for my own poetry. I'll have to name the sounds of modern English for the purposes of alliterative poetry. And it's clear the only way to do that. It's like, I'm not going to name them things like dog, cat, toy, or ball. I would do things like day, birch, two, and so forth. The rune names are the obvious choice to go back for that, just as I suggested for the original Elder Futharch. And so in early 2023, so I get around to this project of assigning names to the sounds. And then it doesn't take me. I mean, originally I was only just going to do it as a poetic project, and then when it was staring me right in the face, so to speak, I realized putting stave forms with them as well opened up a whole new ton of possibilities. I could then go and write these things in modern English and do the kind of runic writing I always was doing with the old languages, and then write with the same precision in modern English. And that this would have further benefits for the poetic mission as well.
Yeah.
I would say those are the two major streams as they were the catalysts of this.
Makes sense. As a poet, you're like, I need to just create my own system to make this work beautifully.
Yeah, so it would not be an exaggeration to say that a big part of creating the American Futharch was that my alliterative poetic revival can be the best it can be, and that can be all that it can be.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and this definitely is like this. It's innovative, but still grounded in tradition, which I think is a really wonderful thing. And some people, like, I see both sides of this, where people are just ungrounded from tradition and just want to innovate, and they keep reinventing the wheel and going off into these fantasies that have no connection to reality. And then I see some people who are just so focused on the past and on what their idea of tradition that they're also not in reality. They want to relive this AD or 900 AD fantasy they have in their head, and meanwhile they're living in modern America. So I like what you're doing. Is there, like, how do you see this tension of innovation and tradition?
Of innovation tradition. You'd be a little more specific.
Do you see yourself as part of a tradition of innovation, like in the history of runes?
Well, yes. I do view this, yes, I view this as it is a reform of the tradition. I view it as on the level, it's certainly, as far as the amount of innovation or the amount of reform, it's certainly on par with the amount of reform one sees in, say, Elder Futharch to Younger Futharch.
Right.
So there's no doubt that there is a fairly large amount of reform and innovation here. And I think this was something that in a way I see it, this was something that it was always going to be coming. And perhaps I would say that this return to a system where there's one sound for one stave, and then you can now write American English with runes using the same kind of steps and the same process and in the same way the rune masters, the Elder Futharch did. I think that sort of thing that would have come eventually if it wasn't, if I didn't bring it here, that would have come eventually. I won't have no idea when that would have been, but I think ultimately that would have come eventually.
Yeah, maybe Odin used you to do it.
I was just going to ask, so you're saying the Elder Futharch with like a hard K, but the American Futharch.
Yes.
Right. And so is that like accounting for one of the letters that you've created? Okay, cool.
Yes, in this case, this is number 6, charcoal. So it's starting with that, what we think of as a CH sound instead of like a hard K, like the Elder Futharch name Kanaz.
Yes. So like, for instance, in charcoal, how did you come to the name charcoal for that sound?
In some of these cases, I took inspiration from like Edred's approach. I think Edred was the only, as far as I know, prior to myself, he's the only one who I saw attempted to give modern names to runes. In his book, Alu, there's a table where he gives a short presentation about using the Anglo-Saxon Futharch to write modern English. Yeah. And gives suggested names for the staves. He doesn't change any of the stave forms, just continues the stave shapes, and then gives names to the new ones. And what he came up with for rune number 6 was char. Okay, meaning something burned, which continues Kanaz nicely. I think ultimately in working through that, my feeling is that certainly charcoal, I think, captures elements of Kanaz better than merely char.
Right, and that's because Kanaz, the word Kanaz, that is the word for the sound. One of the meanings is fire,
or primarily torch. Yes,
torch. So there's a semantic, there's like a meaning that is continued through to the ch sound. The charcoal is related to Kanaz in terms of that fire.
Yes. In this particular case, there was definitely a conscious effort to keep it close to these notions of fire. And I think, and this gets close to make another point, since it gets close to that, with as opposed to, like, say, char versus charcoal. Charcoal has much a wider range of meanings to us in modern times. Like, char is maybe not quite as much. I mean, we'd be familiar with the word, but it's a little less commonly. It has a smaller range of meanings.
Yeah, it's not as commonly as used.
Certainly for where there were choices, my preference was definitely to have words that had a wider and richer range of meanings to them.
Right. And so can you say some of those changes that you made, or new names that you use? So like fee, for instance, instead of theo, because fee is a modern English word that is commonly used, but is still evolved from theo.
Well, yes, and that in this case, this is a number of the names are simply just the descendants from their Anglo-Saxon Futharch origins. And fee is one of them. There's a number of others. Let's see, I could go just an example. Let's see, of course, there's the ones that are just more or less straight descendants from the Anglo-Saxon would be fee, thorn, os, ride. Well, gift, kind of, sort of, not exactly the same roots, but it's similar meaning. And then win, hail, need, year, sun. Well, seal in the Old English, it's a really weird word for sun. Okay, so this is the new one. It's more like a more common word for something. Well, two, and then birch. Let's see then. Elk, although that's in a different position. Man, lake, ing, day, and let's see, and ash, and I think that's most of the ones where the names came down pretty much from the Anglo-Saxon.
And what were some of the new names you came up with?
New names besides charcoal. Let's see, there's ooze.
Yeah, ooze. And it's for the ooh sound.
Yes.
And how did you come up with that instead of like a or auroch or uruz?
Well, certainly the reform is definitely the grounding. The reform is phonemic. So there was, after determining that there had to be 33 runes to represent 33 particular sounds. And so there needed to be an ooh rune. And in good runic tradition, ideally, this should be a word that starts with that sound.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, unless you want to make up words or start arbitrarily redefining things, there are not a whole lot of words that start with that sound in modern English.
True. Yeah.
Very, very few. In fact, I
can't think of any at the moment. Oops. That's like, yeah, is that even a word? I guess
that's one I came across. Although that one may have alternate pronunciations like oops.
Ups, yeah.
Oh, yeah, oops or oops is I've seen both. Oodle. That's one. The German prefix form, at least as Americans pronounce it, Uber.
Uber.
Yeah.
I guess which everyone knows because of a certain rideshare company.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one. You're right.
And so that turned out to be the limitations on like the name. In other words, like the small number of choices in many cases that occurs for more runes than you might have expected. I mean, like in some cases, I guess the alternative would be to like use a name that just contains the sound as opposed to starting with the sound. But that's generally something to be avoided.
Right.
The elder Futharch survived having 2 out of 24 that didn't start with their sound. I think that American Futharch has only one that does not start with its sound, and that's ing. And it's, well, yeah, because that's a situation that hasn't changed in 2,500 years.
Right. And ing is still the name of the god.
Yes.
Ing. And there's nothing that starts with ng. Nat, maybe, but that's not a ng sound.
The ing sound. Yeah, that's a little bit that's a tricky phoneme or sound. But no, there's nothing in English that starts with that particular sound.
Yeah.
And even if my dictionary has a couple things maybe from some African languages where it would start with that sound, but the inevitability is if an English speaker tried saying them, they'd probably stick a vowel in front of it.
Right. And it is a sound that is used in American.
Like for instance, we can contrast it to the words singer and sinner.
Yeah.
They're precisely the same, except one is a normal N as in need sound, the other is the ing sound.
Yeah. Yeah, and in American English currently, like it seems as though the Latin, not only the Latin letters, but the way they're written is outdated by hundreds of years. Like there are so many letters in, like write, for instance. You can do a write with a WRIGHT for like a shipwright or something, but that doesn't, like most of those letters are silent. Like a lot of those letters are silent, like the G and the H and the W. So, and as I've been studying Sanskrit a little bit more, not like in depth yet, but how clear and precise that is, and how everything is, like you can pronounce any word that you read perfectly because because every it's all exactly correlative, as you were saying. The runes used to be with Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, and Proto-Germanic.
Yes.
So do you think maybe someday your American Futharch can become the dominant writing system in the US?
Well, I'd like to see it become the dominant rune system for writing American English. But I mean, no, I don't want it as far as outside of, I mean, I wouldn't want to see it like computer operating systems. Like, I wouldn't want to have a switch on the Mac to like show all the names in American Futharch. I think that would come too close. Yeah, the kind of things, spreading too much over modernity. It's modernity's tendency to profane things.
I see, yes.
And that gets back to another point I made, like, the whole mundane or magical. Like, I mean, maybe scholars will debate and others will debate, like, where the elder Futhark runes originally meant to be primarily magical. I'll come straight out and say the American Futharch are meant to be primarily magical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They're, of course, essentially communicative, as I indicated earlier, because they have to be communicative to be magical.
Yeah. Can you speak more to that? Like, what do you mean by magic equals communication?
Well, one approach to magic is to view it as like a kind of how it works as a kind of communication between, say, like a sender on one hand and a receiver on the other hand, and then a message transmitted between them. So like if one say carves some words as a magic spell, that can be analyzed as a sense, in other words, like the spell that's carved and the way it's carved and maybe the mindset of the carver, these are parts of the message and they're sending, and that this is supposed to go out somewhere and to a receiver, and who would then reply with the desired events or changes in reality.
Yeah, right. Well said.
And what do you generally see as that other? Is that like the Norns? Is it the Aesir and the Vanir? Is it the universe? Is it yourself? What is it? Or does it matter? Is it the unknown?
I think I would say magicians should experiment with different models on those. Certain people will have different views as to who the ostensible receiver is. I think it could say that there is a receiver, but whether you view it as, say, the Aesir or the Vanir, your higher self, I would say I don't necessarily have a dogmatic answer for that, but then this would get me onto a track of whether I go down a road talking about a little bit about Schopenhauer and his notion of the well. And I would have to blend into this the idea of like an idea inspired by Schopenhauer that magic is like what we have as will. There's like various grades or levels of will, and that magic could be seen as perhaps one of the higher grades of will. So in that case, that might imply that one's higher self is the recipient of the communication, or at least that approach. But anyway, at least to touch on an example, I was in at least the folk tales I was studying for my PhD, which these are like magical poets rather than runes, but like at various times they're chanting verses. The verses appear to call upon various entities. Sometimes they'll call on God, sometimes the devil, sometimes they'll be aimed at the person they're trying to chant on directly. And frequently it doesn't seem to matter who the purported recipient of the communication is. So I mean, they may say they may think they're calling on God to cause the effect, or they may think they're calling on the devil to cause the effect. But is that what's actually going on if they get an effect? Not necessarily. So I think a lot of people they'll have to take their own view on whether they think. I mean, maybe there's multiple receivers. I mean, maybe in some cases you could. I mean, just because like the devil causes an effect to happen in one instance, that doesn't mean like it can't be like Odin in another one, or like a Christian angel in another one. There's probably, or like maybe a local land spirit. You take a very polytheist animist view of the universe, there's potentially a lot of people that might choose to answer a magical communication.
Yeah. And I guess if you are communicating to them specifically, it might help. So another thing that you touched on, but I think might warrant some elucidation, is this why it's good to use the runes that correspond to the language instead of, like, for instance, using the Elder Futhark to write in modern English.
Okay, excellent point, Tom.
Magically.
Okay, yes, okay, good. Can narrow it down. I would say magically first. Yeah, I view this, and partly this is a way of, it comes down to what I would see is if one's using this for the sounds of the language are a key part of this. And that this is a way to treat all the sounds with equal dignity. In other words, then each of the all the sounds can be viewed as peers to each other without some of the sounds being considered like, second class sounds. And this also has like implications if you're like analyzing these magically. If you're say carving a sun rune, you're carving sun, that the kind of lightning bolt shaped rune. We have the various ways of looking at it, to what the sun symbolizes, and the meanings behind that. And then this goes to a reason to use the new runes, like, well, if you consider a sound like ship, if you're going to treat this sound with equal dignity to the others, it needs to have its own name, so you can have its own esoteric analysis and like pair it with meaning. Because otherwise, if you try to do, like, say, the Latinate approach, if you consider it a combination of, say, like the sun and hail runes, like, you have to ask yourself, does that really make sense to view that sound as just like the sum of sun and hail, or sun and charcoal, or some other two rune combination? And ultimately, the answer to that has to be no, it doesn't make sense to view it as simply a combination, the sum of two other sounds. And then this goes to the flip side around of it, is like why I did not use, say, the rune stan in the Anglo-Saxon Futharch, which meant stone, and this seems to be an ST rune. Putting aside, in other words, it stood for two sounds. Putting aside why there's an ST rune in the Anglo-Saxon Futharch to begin with, I mean, how would you treat this for magical purposes? Is it to be its own thing, or is it to be considered the sum of, say, Sawillo and Tiwaz, or sun and two? Because like sonically, it certainly is the sum of like sun and two.
Yeah.
And so that these kinds, so this is an illustration, I guess, the kind of considerations where that's led to restoring the whole one sound, one rune approach.
Right. And so maybe there's also like a coherence when there's one-for-one correlation between the sounds and the letters, the symbols. In my experience with magic, the more coherent the message is, the more potent it is.
Yes, exactly.
And you also may be communicating things you didn't intend to communicate by using like, for instance, Elder Futharch letters to write American English.
And with the American Futharch, to extend one of those points there about the coherence, this is, I guess, I also see it this way. The runic writing with the American Futharch, it becomes, your writing was effectively concretized sound. You're taking the sound of your speech and making it directly material, and certainly with much more exactness than you can by using any other runic system to write American English.
Yeah. So I think this is a fantastic project, and we've already gone a full hour, but how can people get involved? How can they learn more about the American Futharch, and how can they get in contact with you?
Okay, well, yes, in late March, I created a website for the American Futharch. It's simply americanfutharch.com. And I have a contact page there where you can send a web form, and there's my email address if you want to email me. And I think some resources. There's a downloadable printable guide to the system. It's a short one page, the basics. In the future, I'll be launching an online course that connects both. It's in the American Futharch runes and simple alliterative poetry. So they do go very well together, especially with them teaching each other. But also right now on the website, there is the American English rune poem, which I wrote for this runic system. And
yeah.
Eirik, would you be willing to read a poem for us? Maybe that one or something? Just, I love hearing poetry aloud, so I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you if you're willing to read one or recite one.
Okay, a few stanzas. If I do the whole thing, that would take about 7.5 minutes.
Yeah, just do a few then.
Okay.
That'd be so
I'll
cool.
start with I'll start with the we'll do the first four here. I'm gonna take a break. Let's see. Okay, see this. Okay. Actually, I'll try I'll try singing them a little bit because that's something I've been practicing on singing them. Make no promises about what key I'm in. Fee is a force that fuels our world in myriad sorts, like money for service, as if formal fief made it flow like old, and still it'll bring strife quite often. Ooze is an uber form, with oodles of varieties that flow thickly, yet are filled with life, such as sap, blood, and honey, but its secret is also in the wet, dank mud of waters deep. Thorn is a threat to a thumb unwary, and ruin is risked if it's recklessly grasped. 'Tis the simple defense of a stationary plant, but magnified in might its Mjolnir's power. Os is honored for the art he won, precious poetry on his perilous quest. The runes we round and write today, and the woad that works all wonders with both. And that's the first four.
Cool. That was awesome. Thank you. Bravo.
Yeah,
Bravo.
that was great.
Yeah, this has been a fantastic talk. Do you have any other final thoughts or things that you're excited about coming up that you want to share, or is this a good place to end?
Well, let me see the quick. Take a look here. Quick mentions.
Yeah.
Final thoughts here. Yep. Let's see. I'm going to be okay. I'll be at a. Have a table at the Beaver County Heathen Festival in late July.
That sounds fun.
I'll have all my poetry books there, and see. I think I will also be doing a poetry performance. So certainly, if anyone's there, they can come and pick my brain about the American Futharch.
That's awesome.
Let's see. And okay, other things. I think that's the big thing coming up in July as far as events they'll be at.
Sweet.
And let's see. I think it'll be a longer term, but I think there will ultimately be. As I mentioned, there's a course on the American Futharch and alliterative poetry coming out. There will be more courses after that in the future. Eventually, of course, there will be a book. I won't make any projections about how soon though.
Exciting.
Great. Well, then we can.
And I still have, for those interested in my academic work, I still have some of those in the pipe that will hopefully come through the other end of the pipe within the next, at least a couple of them, hopefully within the next year or 6 months or whenever.
Wonderful.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thanks again for taking the time to chat with us. It was really wonderful, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.